Texas has its own way of holding on to a mystery. The land is wide, the sky stretches forever, and the nights feel older than time itself. People out here know the difference between a plane, a helicopter, a star, a satellite, and something that just doesn't belong. They're not quick to jump to conclusions, especially the older folks who've lived their whole lives under these skies. That's what makes this story different. Because the people at the center of it weren't thrill seekers, weren't storytellers, weren't trying to start a legend. They were a grandmother, her young grandson, and a church-going friend. Just three ordinary Texans driving home after dinner on a cold December night in 1980. And what they saw on that lonely stretch of road would change their lives forever. Not because it was spectacular, but because it hurt them. This isn't a story of lights in the sky. It's a story of an encounter that burned skin, melted plastic, tangled reality, and ended with one question hanging in the air like smoke. What could do this? Let's start at the beginning. The date is December 29, 1980. The little town of Dayton, Texas, is settling into the quiet of winter. Holiday lights are still hanging, but the celebrations are fading. Most families are indoors. The cold has pushed everyone off the roads. Betty Cash, a small business owner, is driving her 1980 Oldsmobile Cutlass. She's strong-willed, responsible, steady, the kind of woman everyone trusts. Next to her sits her friend, Vickie Landrum, a devout Christian in her 50s, with a reputation for honesty so solid it almost worked against her later. In the back seat, Vickie's 7-year-old grandson Colby is half asleep, half excited from the evening out. The three are driving down Highway FM 1485, a remote pine-lined stretch of road where the trees crowd close and the sky above can look impossibly dark. They're not expecting anything unusual. But life has a habit of slipping in the extraordinary when you least expect it. About an hour into the drive, they notice something ahead. A light. At first, it seems like a plane coming in low. They joke that maybe it's heading toward Houston Intercontinental Airport, but it isn't moving like a plane. It's hovering, then drifting, then dropping lower. As they draw closer, the road lights up with a harsh glow, a silent, fiery brilliance that seems to pulse with heat. Betty slows the car. She leans forward, squinting. The object comes into view between the tall trees, a massive diamond-shaped craft, glowing like molten metal, hanging in the air directly over the road. It's not elegant. It's not smooth. It looks heavy, mechanical, industrial, like something built for function, not beauty. And from its underside, a bright roaring flame shoots downward like a torch, flaring, cutting off, flaring again. Heat washes across the car as if someone opened an oven door. The smell hits next. Burning asphalt, hot metal, maybe something chemical. Colby starts to cry, terrified. He begs them not to get any closer. Vickie, who has spent her whole life with faith as her anchor, whispers that maybe it's the second coming. Maybe this is something divine. The truth is, none of them know what they're looking at. Betty brings the car to a stop. They're only a few dozen yards from the craft now. The heat is so strong it fogs the windshield. The night is utterly silent, except for the intermittent roar of the flame. What happens next becomes the heart of the entire mystery. Vickie unbuckles her seatbelt, steps out, and shields Colby's eyes. She says she feels compelled, not by curiosity, but by some mix of fear and awe. She drags him out of the car, telling him that if this really is something holy, they have to see it. Betty stays in the driver's seat for a moment, but the heat keeps growing. She can feel it on her face, on her arms, as if the air itself is cooking. Finally, Betty steps out too, and the moment she does, the heat slams into her like a wave. It's not natural heat. It digs into the skin. It penetrates. It feels like radiation, though none of them have any reason to think in those terms. She stares at the craft, trying to make sense of it. The diamond shape rotates slowly, wobbling, almost like it's trying to steady itself. Its surface glows white hot, The torch of flame reappears, blasting downward, shaking the road. And then the silence breaks. A deep rhythmic thumping fills the air, not from the craft. From the sky around it, one by one, lights appear above the tree line. Not stars, not the craft, something else. Helicopters, dozens of them, moving fast, coming in low, surrounding the object in a loose formation. These aren't news helicopters. These aren't civilian choppers out for a joyride. They look military, heavy, purposeful. The three witnesses stand frozen as the helicopters close in. Some have spotlights, some don't. Some are the familiar shape of a CH-47 Chinook, huge dual-rotor beasts that the Army uses for heavy lifting. Others are smaller, faster. The helicopters circle the glowing craft like a swarm of insects around a fire. And here's where the story starts to fork, because people later asked, why would military helicopters surround a UFO? But the better question might be, why were they already in the air? We'll come back to that. For now, the heat becomes unbearable. Vickie pulls Colby back into the car, but the metal door handle is so hot it burns her hand. Betty tries to follow, but the radiation-like heat hits her full force. Her skin reddens instantly. Her hair feels singed. Her eyes begin to water and burn. She collapses back into the seat, gasping, and slams the car door shut. The craft wobbles again. There's a blinding flash of white light, and it shoots upward, climbing into the air with a roar of flame and a violent, fiery brilliance. The helicopters chase it, dozens of them, engines pounding the night. Soon the sky is empty again. The road is quiet. The encounter is over, but the damage is just beginning. As Betty starts driving again, she realizes her skin is blistering. Not later, now. Her face is swollen, her neck is bright red, and her eyes hurt to blink. Vickie is nauseous. Her eyelids feel gritty and burned. Her hair looks singed at the tips. Even little Colby has burns on his face. By the time they reach home, Betty is losing strength. She collapses in bed. The next day, she can barely move. Within 48 hours, her skin blisters so severely it peels away in layers. Her hair falls out in clumps. She has painful sores in her mouth. Her eyes are nearly swollen shut. Doctors are baffled. They've never seen radiation burns like this without actual radiation equipment. And the strange part, Vickie and Colby are burned too, but not as severely. The closer you were to the object, the worse the damage. Weeks pass. Betty is hospitalized multiple times. She loses patches of hair. Her immune system collapses. She suffers chronic pain, weakness, and recurring skin infections. One doctor finally tells her, these are injuries consistent with exposure to ionizing radiation or microwaves. But no one can explain how or why that would happen on a rural Texas road. Vickie, meanwhile, is suffering strange long-term effects. Her eyesight worsens, her skin shows signs of long-term damage, and her grandson develops emotional trauma that lasts years. This isn't imagination. This isn't hysteria. These are real medical injuries. And that's when they do something no other UFO witnesses had done before. They decide to sue the United States government not for money, for answers. Their case lands on the desk of the U.S. Air Force and Department of Defense. What happens next is a masterclass in deflection. The Air Force claims they had no helicopters in the area that night. None. Zero. Not even one. The Army says the same. Civil aviation logs show nothing. Radar logs show nothing. The military insists, repeatedly and aggressively, that no aircraft, especially not a large formation of helicopters, were operating in that area of Texas. But dozens of locals came forward saying they saw the helicopters that night too. A former police officer reported the same. A local farmer saw them, even a pilot. But the official position stays firm. No helicopters, no craft, no operation. Nothing happened. Betty and Vickie's lawsuit makes it all the way to federal court. Their attorney tries to prove that if the military was testing some kind of secret aircraft and exposed civilians to radiation, they deserved an explanation. The government's response? There is no evidence the US was operating helicopters in that region on that date. The case is dismissed, not because the judge proved them wrong, but because the judge couldn't prove the government was involved. It was a legal paradox, when the only people who could confirm the truth were the same people denying it. Still, pieces of the story leaked out over the years. A helicopter crewman at Fort Hood later claimed he remembered something unusual. A man stationed at Ellington Field hinted they'd scrambled aircraft that night. A retired Chinook pilot said he'd heard rumors of an operation gone wrong. But nothing solid, nothing official, just shadows. The kind that hang over a mystery without ever touching ground. So what could this thing have been? Some believe it was an experimental nuclear-powered aircraft, the kind of tech that never reached the public eye. Something unstable, dangerous, and not meant to be seen. Others think it was a malfunctioning military craft, escorted by helicopters trying to bring it under control. And of course, some believe it was extraterrestrial. And the helicopters were there to respond, to contain, or to pursue. Whatever it was, it emitted radiation strong enough to alter lives permanently. That part isn't speculation. That part is documented. Betty Cash never fully recovered. Her health continued to decline for the rest of her life. She believed until her dying day that what she saw wasn't human-made. Vickie never forgave the government for refusing to acknowledge the helicopters. "You can lie to a person," she once said, "but don't lie to an entire town." Colby grew up, but he never shook the fear of that night. It stayed with him, a memory that refuses to fade. The Cash-Landrum case remains one of the most disturbing encounters in UFO history, not because it was mysterious, but because it was physical. 3 people walked away, burned, sick, traumatized, and nobody ever answered for it. Not the military, not the government, not science, just silence. A silence that stretches across that lonely Texas road even today. And if you stand there at night, under those same tall pines, with the wind shifting through the dark, you can almost imagine the glow between the trees, the heat, the roar of helicopters, the moment when the sky opened and something impossible drifted down. A moment that left 3 people changed forever. A moment that still defies explanation. A moment that, even after all these years, refuses to be forgotten. When you look back on the Cash-Landrum case, the moment that keeps coming up, over and over, isn't the craft itself, it's the helicopters, because the craft could be chalked up to anything. Experimental technology, atmospheric distortion, imagination under stress. But the helicopters? Those are real machines. They make noise, they leave witnesses, they file flight logs, they burn jet fuel, and they don't just appear out of nowhere in formation over a rural Texas road at night unless they were waiting for something. And that's where this story starts to unravel in ways most people never hear about. Because after the encounter, after the burns, after the hospital visits, after the lawsuits, some people who had stayed quiet for years began to speak, not loudly, not publicly, just enough to cast new shadows on an already dark mystery. Let's pull those threads. First, the helicopters weren't just seen by the 3 witnesses in the car. At least 24 locals later said they saw or heard a large formation of helicopters around the same time. Some were military veterans who recognized the chop thunder of CH-47 Chinooks. Others just knew what helicopters sounded like. Because in East Texas, people hunt, they fish, they farm, they work outdoors. You know what flies over your land? One man said it sounded like the whole sky was coming apart. Another described it as a hurricane made of engines. Yet officially, no helicopters, not one. And that's the first contradiction. Because when the Air Force says none of their aircraft were in the area, they're speaking narrowly. Ellington Field was Air Force. Fort Hood was Army. The National Guard operated helicopters too. Then there were contractors, special projects groups, and black budget programs we still know almost nothing about. A helicopter is a helicopter. But a report, that's paperwork, and paperwork can disappear. Which brings us to the second contradiction. In 1981, a quiet man named Lieutenant Colonel George Saran was assigned to investigate, not to debunk, to actually look into the claims. Saran interviewed dozens of witnesses across the region. He traveled from base to base. He talked to pilots, maintenance crews, flight coordinators. When he finished his months-long inquiry, he wrote a confidential note that surprised even him. These witnesses are credible. They are not lying. Something happened. He believed Vickie. He believed Betty. He believed Colby. He believed the locals who heard the helicopters. But he still couldn't find a single military officer willing to say their helicopters were involved. That silence bothered him. It bothered him enough that he started asking questions outside his official channels. And what he heard quietly, over coffee or behind closed doors, was this. If something happened out there, it wasn't our program. That leads to the biggest question. What kind of project would require dozens of helicopters as an escort, yet leave the local bases completely in the dark? There are only a few possibilities, and none of them are comforting. One theory is that the craft was an experimental nuclear-powered aircraft, the kind of thing the US began researching as far back as the 1950s under programs like NERVA and Project Pluto. The idea was simple. Use nuclear reactors to power aircraft that could stay airborne for days or weeks. The reality was horrifying. These engines leaked radiation. They were unstable. They were dangerous even on the ground. Most of these programs were shut down quietly, but remnants were rumored to continue into the 1980s. Imagine a test flight gone wrong, a nuclear propulsion prototype losing control over East Texas. What would it take to recover it? You'd need helicopters, many of them, some to track it, some to contain it, some to escort or intercept. And you'd need secrecy, airtight secrecy. Would the US admit that a nuclear craft malfunctioned and irradiated civilians? Not in a million years. But there's another layer. Because some witnesses described the craft's movement as unstable, like it was malfunctioning or overheated. Betty said it wobbled like a damaged washing machine. Vickie said it moved like something trying to stay in the air against its will. This wasn't a graceful alien ship, this was something struggling. And that detail aligns with a station that nuclear engineers know well, thermal runaway. A nuclear engine overheating is like a volcano in a box. You don't land it, you contain it, or you escort it to a safe zone. If that's what happened, the helicopters weren't strange at all. They were standard protocol. But the nuclear aircraft theory only answers part of the mystery. It doesn't explain the shape, a glowing diamond. It doesn't explain the intense, skin-peeling radiation that felt directional and pulsed in waves, and it doesn't explain why dozens of highly trained helicopter crews were airborne on a holiday week when no official operations were scheduled. That's where the second theory enters. A theory that gets whispered more than spoken. A classified retrieval operation. Something wasn't being tested. Something was being chased. In this version, the craft wasn't American, wasn't Soviet, wasn't anything built on this planet, and the helicopters weren't escorting it. They were responding to it. There had been unusual aerial radar signatures across the South that month. Military channels had chatter about fast-moving targets and non-conventional returns. Bases from Louisiana to New Mexico had logged unidentified objects. What if the one over Texas was simply the one that got low enough to track? A UFO descending, malfunctioning, over a highway, right in the path of a woman driving home. In that scenario, the helicopters weren't lying in wait. They were scrambled. A full intercept mission. Betty wasn't supposed to see it. Vickie wasn't supposed to stand under it. Colby wasn't supposed to be exposed to it. It was an accident of timing, a collision between everyday life and a classified emergency. The government wouldn't admit that either. because admitting that would mean admitting we weren't in control. There's a third possibility, the one skeptics lean on, but that creates more problems than it solves. They say the witnesses saw a helicopter flare exercise, or a re-entry burn, or a plane with landing lights, but none of those theories explain the burns, the hair loss, the medical documents, the plastic dashboard melting, the radio interference, the craft's shape, the descending flame, the dozens of helicopters, the military silence, the eyewitness consistency, the fact that Betty and Vickie refused to change their story for the rest of their lives. Skeptics explain away the unknown by erasing the parts that don't fit, but you can't erase burns deep enough to scar tissue. You can't erase radiation injuries with a shrug. If this was a misunderstanding, then it was the most physically destructive misunderstanding ever recorded, and there's not a single case like it before or after. Now, here's where the story gets more unsettling. Years later, when Colby was an adult, he said something that changed the conversation. He said the thing he remembered most wasn't the craft. It wasn't the heat. It wasn't even the helicopters. It was the sound. He said, it sounded like metal screaming. That's not a flare, not a jet, not a helicopter. That's something mechanical being pushed beyond its limits. Betty, when asked in her final interview, said she believed the craft was trying to land or crash, and the helicopters were trying to prevent it. But Vickie had a different view. She believed they were trying to capture it. Two interpretations. Same moment, same trauma. One fact remains. Something was struggling in that sky. And whatever it wasn't built to fly cleanly. The government's final position hasn't changed in 40 years. They maintain no helicopters, no operation, no aircraft, no radiation, no responsibility. But documents later obtained under FOIA revealed an uncomfortable truth. Fort Hood's CH-47 unit did have aircraft available that night. They just never disclosed whether they were flying. Another document showed that a classified training exercise was planned for that week, but the details remained redacted. Then there was a rumor repeated by several retired pilots that a helicopter group from Bergstrom Air Force Base was temporarily reassigned, but no records show where they flew. It's like chasing shadows in a maze. Every answer leads to another locked door. So where does that leave us? 3 people were injured. One of them suffered for the rest of her life. Their car was damaged. Witnesses saw aircraft. The military denied everything, and the case faded from national attention, not because it was solved, but because it was too complicated, too physical, too real, too dangerous. UFO cases are easier when they stay at a distance. Lights in the sky, shapes in the dark, things that can be dismissed. But when a craft comes close enough to burn you, to blind you, to scar you, that crosses a line between curiosity and liability, a line between mystery and responsibility, and governments don't like crossing that line. So they don't. They step back. They close doors. They tighten their grip, and they let the witnesses fade into the background. But Betty never faded. Vickie never faded. Colby never faded. Their encounter sits in UFO history like a bruise, a visible mark of something powerful beneath the surface. A reminder that whatever happened on that cold December night wasn't just unexplained. It was undeniable. And maybe that's why the truth remains so quiet. Not because there's nothing to say, but because saying it would open a door that some people would rather keep locked forever.